Imagine you spend 30 years building a case. You gather the evidence, you replicate the findings, you survive the peer review, and you watch a research base grow from a handful of studies into a body of work no serious scholar can ignore. Then someone in a leadership meeting looks at all of that data and asks a simple question. So what do we do with it? That is where ethnic matching sits right now. The case has been made across decades. The question deferred for 30 years is whether the field and the institutions it is trying to change are finally ready to turn that research into lasting policy. This is episode 9 of season 3 of The Cultural Context of Knowledge, the Inheritance Tax. We have walked a long historical path together this season. We started before the term ethnic matching existed, with the Black, Indigenous, Mexican, and Asian educators who were doing the work long before the Academy had a name for it. We traced the question through the Coleman Report, through the post-Brown displacement of Black teachers, through the first wave of empirical studies, through the modern quantitative wave that established causal evidence, and through an honest accounting of what the numbers can and cannot say. Today we turn to the question educators, policymakers, and community leaders should be asking. What does it actually take to build an educator workforce that reflects the diverse reality of our students? What has worked? What has failed? And why does the gap between what the research recommends and what institutions actually build remain so wide? Part 1. The gap that has not closed. Let us state the demographic reality clearly, because this is about the entire breadth of our nation's children. Students of color now make up the majority of the public school population in the United States. In urban districts, in rapidly changing suburban neighborhoods, and in agricultural and tribal rural communities, our classrooms hold Mexican students, Black students, Indigenous students, and Asian and Pacific Islander students. Yet nationwide, the teaching workforce remains roughly 80% white. That gap is not closing at a rate that matches the urgency of the research. In many regions, the demographic mismatch is widening. What this means in practical terms is that millions of Black, Mexican, Native, and Asian students will spend most or all of their PK through 12 careers without a single teacher who shares their racial, ethnic, or cultural background. We know from 30 years of research what that absence costs, how it affects academic growth, advanced course placement, disciplinary equity, and whether a child feels that school is a place where their identity is valued as an asset. So the question is not whether the research is compelling enough. The question is, what has stood in the way of acting on it, and what the scholars and practitioners who made real progress have done differently. Pause and reflect. Think about the school district or institution you are connected to right now. What does the educator workforce look like next to the racial and ethnic diversity of the student body? Do you know what specific programs or policy changes your institution has tried in order to close that gap? Part 2. 3 structural barriers. Before we look at what has worked, we have to be candid about the structural forces working against progress. The shortage of teachers of color is not an accident or a lack of interest. It is the direct product of structural barriers in place for generations. The first barrier is gatekeeping at the entry point. The traditional route into teaching runs through high-stakes licensure exams, complex certification hurdles, and program costs that screen out candidates of color at disproportionate rates. Licensure tests in particular carry a documented history of differential pass rates by race and ethnicity. Those disparities do not reflect a candidate's potential to be a strong teacher. They reflect tests that carry cultural and linguistic biases and do not measure community cultural wealth or relational teaching skill. Scholars like Dr. Ana Maria Villegas and Dr. Tamara Lucas have shown for years that traditional credentialing systems often misrecognize cultural competence as a deficit. The second barrier is the economic burden of entry. Teacher preparation often requires unpaid or underpaid student teaching quarters, high tuition, and mounting student loan debt, followed by starting salaries that lag behind other professions. Candidates of color, who are frequently first-generation college students facing economic hurdles, are hit hardest. When entering the profession means taking on heavy debt without immediate pay, qualified Black, Mexican, Indigenous, and Asian candidates are funneled away from education. The third barrier is retention and climate. Districts that manage to recruit teachers of color often watch them leave within 3 to 5 years. The reason is the diversity tax. Teachers of color are regularly expected to serve as uncompensated cultural translators, as language translators for families who do not speak English, as the sole disciplinarians for students of color, and as representatives on every equity committee, all while facing microaggressions and institutional isolation. As Dr. Travis Bristol's research on teacher retention shows, when school environments do not support, protect, and value teachers of color, recruitment becomes a revolving door. What the research says: pathways that worked and the people building them. Despite these barriers, scholars and community leaders have designed pathways that work. Looking at the evidence, 4 models stand out, each led by researchers and practitioners who refuse to accept the status quo. First, grow your own initiatives. Instead of waiting for candidates to get through hostile institutional routes, grow your own programs. Recruit directly from local communities, high schools, paraprofessionals, and community organizations. They offer paid preparation, culturally relevant mentoring, and clear routes into the classroom. Look at Pathway to Teaching, founded by Dr. Margarita Bianco. It engages high school students of color in exploring educational equity and teaching as a social justice profession, helping young Black, Mexican, and Indigenous youth see themselves as future educators long before college. Look at Oregon Teacher Pathways, a model I built with my team and now led and expanded by Tanya Lubas. It recruits, mentors, and sustains high school and college students of color through culturally responsive cohorts that bridge high school, higher education, and district employment. Look at Call Me Mister, created by Dr. Roy Jones and his colleagues at Clemson University, which has built a national network for preparing and placing Black male educators in elementary classrooms. Scholars like Dr. Conrad Gist and Dr. Travis Bristol have documented through national research handbooks that these community-rooted pathways succeed because they honor the cultural capital of candidates and remove economic friction. But as Dr. Gist points out, grow your own programs require long-term institutional funding. When a district treats a grow your own program as a short-term grant project rather than permanent infrastructure, the pathway collapses the moment the grant ends. Second, targeted financial incentives and paid residencies. High retention programs provide full tuition coverage, living stipends during student teaching, and loan forgiveness in exchange for multi-year commitments to local schools. When financial support is paired with dedicated cohort mentoring, completion rates rise sharply across Black, Mexican, Asian, and Native candidates. Third, strategic partnerships with minority-serving institutions. Historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges and universities have long prepared a disproportionate share of the nation's teachers of color. When districts build authentic funded recruitment routes with MSIs, rather than visiting for an annual career fair, candidate placement and retention rise significantly. Fourth, workplace climate and retention reform. As the research consistently shows, recruitment without retention is an expensive failure. Look at the work of Dr. Rita Coley and the Institute for Teachers of Color committed to racial justice. Dr. Coley saw that traditional professional development rarely addresses the racialized climate and isolation and institutional trauma teachers of color experience in schools. Through the Institute, she built an identity-affirming space designed to support, sustain, and retain educators of color committed to racial justice. Her research shows that when teachers of color have racial affinity communities, critical mentorship, and spaces that honor their racial literacy, their commitment to staying in the classroom rises. Successful districts copy this by building racial affinity groups, protecting teachers of color from the uncompensated diversity tax, and training administrators to create identity-safe schools. There is a recurring pattern in the history of educational policy we have to name plainly: the difference between aspiration and infrastructure. Every major wave of social awareness produces a surge of aspirational statements, mission statements, diversity task forces, district pledges, temporary recruitment budgets. But when politics shift or budgets tighten, that early enthusiasm fades. What remains is not infrastructure, it is only intention. Following the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, school boards and universities across the country pledged new commitments to racial equity and teacher diversity. Strategic plans were updated overnight. But in the years after, a fierce political backlash targeted DEI initiatives, ethnic studies, and teacher diversity programs across multiple states. Aspirational goals never anchored in permanent legislation or collective bargaining agreements were quickly defunded or abandoned. This pattern is not new. When Brown versus Board of Education came down in 1954, desegregation was carried out in a way that integrated students while displacing tens of thousands of black teachers and principals across the South. The legal victory had no structural policy to protect the black educator workforce, and U.S. public education still carries that loss today. The takeaway for policymakers and education leaders is clear. Aspiration will not solve a structural crisis. Progress requires infrastructure. It requires permanent line-item funding, legislative backing, systemic retention protections, and clear administrative accountability. Intention is temporary. Infrastructure lasts. Part 3. The geography problem in urban, suburban, and rural schools. As we look at policy implementation, we also have to address geography. The conversation about teacher diversity has historically centered on urban districts. Urban centers matter, but focusing only on urban settings ignores the demographic shifts happening across suburban and rural communities. Suburban districts across the country have seen dramatic demographic shifts over the past 2 decades. Suburbs are now home to large populations of Mexican, Black, Asian, and immigrant students. Yet many suburban districts run on predominantly white teaching forces and have almost no pathway infrastructure for educator diversity. In rural communities, the representation gap is often most severe. Consider indigenous students attending schools on or near tribal communities, where native teacher pathways are urgently needed and chronically underfunded. Consider Mexican students in rural agricultural towns, Black students in the rural South, and Asian and refugee communities in rural pockets across the Midwest. In these places, teacher shortages are acute, and the distance from university preparation programs makes local, grow-your-own pathways even more essential. Effective policy cannot be one-size-fits-all. A policy that works for an urban district with several university partners will not work for a rural district 2 hours from the nearest campus. We need regional, state-funded frameworks that fit pathway solutions to rural, suburban, and urban communities alike. The research has given us the evidence. Programs like Pathway to Teaching, Oregon Teacher Pathways, and Call Me Mister have shown us the blueprint. What remains is the political and institutional will to turn promising models into permanent policy. And as we look ahead, we have to recognize that this conversation cannot stay inside PK through 12 classrooms. Next week on The Cultural Context of Knowledge, we move beyond the PK through 12 schoolhouse door and step into higher education. Why? Because for the first time in United States history, the population under 21 years of age is more than half people of color. This is a demographic reality I saw coming in my own research back in 2009. When I analyzed national birth rate data that year, birth rates for Mexican and Asian populations were growing at rates 120 to 250 times higher than white and black birth rates, while black birth rates stayed slightly higher than white birth rates. I knew then that our entire higher education system would soon face a major demographic shift. That shift is here now. So next week we ask, what does ethnic matching look like in higher education? What does it mean for college classrooms, student advisement, faculty mentorship, and university leadership? Join us next week as we take the cultural context of knowledge into higher education and beyond. Three things before we close. If this episode mattered to you, share it with someone. If this episode gave you something worth passing on, pass it on. You can find me wherever you listen to podcasts. Episode companions and the work behind the work are at podcast.donaldeastonbrooks.com. Thank you for listening. I am Dr. Donald Easton-Brooks, and this is the Cultural Context of Knowledge.